The rain pounded against the windows of the downtown Boston police station as Detective Frank Wilson stared at his computer screen, his coffee going cold beside him. The office buzzed with the usual noise, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, officers chatting by the water cooler. But Frank's mind was elsewhere. His fingers hovered over his keyboard as he scrolled through a set of files that shouldn't have been in his possession. "Hey, you still working on the Henderson case?" Detective Liz Chen dropped into the chair beside his desk, startling him. Frank quickly minimized the window. "Yeah, something like that," he muttered, reaching for his coffee. "What's up?" Liz leaned in closer. "The captain's looking for those reports from last week." "Told him you were handling it." Frank nodded, glancing around the busy office. "Tell him I'll have them on his desk by the end of the day. Listen, Liz, can you grab Tom and meet me in the file room in 15 minutes? I found something interesting." Liz raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. That's what Frank appreciated about his small team. They trusted each other. Maybe too much. Exactly 15 minutes later, Frank stood in the cramped file room at the back of the precinct, a place rarely used now that most documents were digital. Detective Tom Reynolds closed the door behind him, his tall frame making the small space feel even tighter. "This better be good," Tom said, crossing his arms. "I was about to interview a witness." Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out a USB drive. "What I'm about to show you doesn't leave this room." He plugged the drive into an old computer in the corner. 3 days ago, we seized the laptop of that hacker we arrested in the credit card scheme. IT cleared it and sent it back, but I decided to dig a little deeper. "Frank, tell me you didn't," Liz started, but Frank cut her off. "The guy had files, encrypted ones. I cracked them open last night and guess what I found?" Frank opened a folder containing several documents and photos. Evidence of a private meeting between FBI Director Eleanor Hayes and Joseph Keller. Tom's face showed confusion. "The casino guy? The one linked to those offshore accounts?" "The very same." Frank nodded, clicking through several surveillance photos. "These are dated just 2 months ago. No official record of this meeting exists anywhere." Liz moved closer to the screen. "This could be completely innocent. A confidential informant meeting, undercover operation planning." "That's what I thought too," Frank interrupted, opening another file. "Until I found this." He played a short audio clip, the sound barely audible in the small room. Director Hayes' distinctive voice came through clearly. "The Bureau can't be connected to this. Make sure it's handled with complete discretion. The usual arrangement applies." The 3 detectives exchanged glances as Frank stopped the recording. "There's more," he said, pulling up financial records. "Transfers from a shell company connected to Keller to an offshore account. And 3 days after each transfer, certain FBI investigations get redirected or shut down completely." Tom let out a low whistle. "Holy shit! If this is what it looks like." Liz trailed off. "It's the FBI director taking bribes to kill investigations," Frank finished her thought. "But here's where it gets complicated." He hesitated, looking at each of his colleagues. "We're not exactly clean ourselves." The room fell silent. They all knew what he meant. Over the past 2 years, their small group of detectives had cut corners, planted evidence on suspects they knew were guilty, but couldn't prove it legally, and skimmed cash from drug busts. It started small, just a little cash here and there to help with Tom's daughter's medical bills that his insurance wouldn't cover. Then it grew. "Internal Affairs has been sniffing around," Frank continued. "Thompson's been asking questions about the Rivera case. It's only a matter of time before they connect the dots." Liz sank into a chair, her face pale. "We'd lose everything. Our jobs, pensions. We'd go to prison. Unless we had leverage," Frank said quietly. "Leverage against someone powerful enough to make an internal investigation disappear." Tom's eyes widened as he caught on. "You can't be serious. Blackmail the FBI director? That's suicide, is it?" Frank clicked through more files. "She's compromised. We have proof. All we need to do is approach her carefully, let her know what we have, and suggest that our silence is worth something." Liz shook her head. "This is insane. Even if it worked, you think the director of the FBI would just roll over? She'd find a way to destroy us." "Not if we're smart about it," Frank argued. "We don't ask for money or anything traceable, just for her to use her influence to quash the IA investigation. She makes a call, our problems go away, and these files stay buried." The 3 fell silent, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. Outside the file room, they could hear the normal sounds of the precinct. a reminder of the careers and lives they stood to lose. "I don't know, Frank," Tom finally said. "This is different from what we've done before." "This is federal." Frank closed the laptop. "Think about your daughter, Tom. Think about her treatments. Think about what happens to her if you're in prison and your benefits are gone." He turned to Liz. "And you're 6 months from retirement. Everything you've worked for, gone in an instant because we helped put away criminals who deserved it." Liz bit her lip, considering. "We'd need to be careful. Very careful." "What about bringing in Jack from tech?" Tom suggested. "He owes me after I kept his name out of that drunk driving incident. He could help secure our communications, make sure we don't leave a trail." Frank nodded slowly. "Good idea. We need to gather more evidence, too. These photos and one audio clip aren't enough. We need something so solid that Hayes has no choice but to help us." "I have a buddy in the DA's office," Liz added, her initial reluctance fading. "He might be able to get us warrant information, help us know when we can safely follow her without raising flags." Frank felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement. "So we're doing this?" Tom took a deep breath. "I don't see that we have a choice. Internal affairs will have enough to move on us within a month. 2 at most. Then we have work to do," Frank said, pocketing the USB drive. "We need surveillance equipment, secure phones, and a plan for approaching her. This has to be airtight." Over the next 3 weeks, the small group of detectives operated like a shadow unit within the department. They used police resources to track Director Hayes' movements, documenting her meetings with Keller and others. Jack from Tech set them up with encrypted communication devices and showed them how to access and record conversations remotely. They worked in shifts, following the director whenever she was in Boston, which happened more frequently than they expected. They photographed her entering private clubs, restaurants, and hotels with people who didn't appear on her official schedule. Frank barely slept, his mind constantly racing with both the thrill of the operation and the fear of getting caught. Every time his phone rang, he expected it to be internal affairs or worse. But as the evidence mounted, so did his confidence. 1 month after discovering the initial files, Frank called Liz and Tom to his apartment on a Sunday evening. Takeout containers littered his dining table, which had been transformed into a command center with laptops, photos, and documents. "I think we have enough," he said, showing them the organized evidence. Phone records showing calls between Hayes and Keller right before investigations were derailed. Photos of at least 6 meetings. 3 more audio recordings, including one where she explicitly mentions keeping an investigation away from his business interests. Liz examined the timeline they'd created. "It's compelling. But how do we approach her? We can't exactly walk into FBI headquarters." "She's attending a charity gala at the Harrington Hotel this Friday," Tom said. "Security, but not overwhelming. We could get close." Frank shook his head. "Too public. We need somewhere private." He pulled up the director's schedule that Jack had somehow accessed. "Next Wednesday, she's doing a closed-door meeting at the field office, then heading to her sister's vacation home in Cape Cod. The road there has a few isolated stretches." "You want to pull over the FBI director?" Liz asked incredulously. "No, just follow her. Make our presence known. Call her from a burner phone and suggest a conversation at the rest stop on Route 6. It's usually empty this time of year." Tom ran a hand through his hair. "And if she calls in backup?" "She won't," Frank said confidently. "Not if we make it clear what we have. She'll want to assess the threat before she does anything. People like her always think they can handle situations themselves." "And what exactly are we asking for?" Liz pressed. "Just one thing, for the internal investigation into our unit to disappear. She has the influence to make that happen with a single phone call. No money, nothing traceable, just professional courtesy from one law enforcement officer to another." Frank smiled thinly, with the understanding that our evidence stays locked away as long as we stay protected. "What if she refuses?" Tom asked. Frank's expression hardened. "Then we have a decision to make. But I don't think she'll refuse. There's too much at stake for her. We just need to make sure she understands that we're serious." The 3 detectives looked at each other, the gravity of their plan settling on them. They had crossed a line weeks ago, but this was different. This was the point of no return. 1 week, Frank said, closing his laptop. 1 week and our problems disappear. What none of them noticed was the small blinking light on Frank's router, a sign that perhaps their technical precautions hadn't been as thorough as they believed. As they finalized their plans, The information was already flowing to servers they couldn't imagine, setting in motion events that would indeed change their careers forever, just not in the way they hoped. The unmarked police car idled by the side of the coastal road, hidden behind a cluster of pine trees. Frank checked his watch for the 5th time in as many minutes. According to their intelligence, FBI Director Hayes should be passing by soon, heading to her sister's vacation home after her meeting at the Boston field office. "She's running late," Liz said from the driver's seat, binoculars trained on the road ahead. Tom shifted uncomfortably in the back. Maybe she changed her plans. Maybe she knows. "She doesn't know," Frank replied more sharply than he intended. The stress of the past week had worn on all of them. Sleep had become a luxury none of them could afford. Jack confirmed her car left the garage 20 minutes ago. "She'll be here." As if on cue, a black SUV with government plates appeared around the bend, moving at a steady pace along the empty stretch of road. "That's her," Frank said, pulse quickening. "Remember the plan. We follow at a distance. I make the call when she reaches the straight stretch by the salt marsh, and we direct her to the rest stop 2 miles ahead." Liz nodded, starting the engine. "And if she doesn't comply?" "She will," Frank said, clutching the burner phone. "She's too smart not to hear us out." They pulled onto the road, keeping several car lengths behind the SUV. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement as they followed the director's vehicle along the winding coastal route. After about 5 minutes, they reached the salt marsh, a wide-open area with no other cars or buildings in sight. "Now," Tom said from the back seat. Frank dialed the number they'd obtained for the director's private line. His hand was steady, but he could feel sweat beading on his forehead. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered. "This is Hayes." "Director Hayes," Frank said, disguising his voice slightly. "Don't be alarmed, but we need to have a conversation about Joseph Keller." There was a brief silence on the other end. Through the windshield, Frank could see the SUV's brake lights flash momentarily. "Who is this?" The director's voice remained calm, professional. "Someone with evidence of your private meetings with Keller. Someone who knows about the investigations that mysteriously changed direction afterward." Frank paused. "Someone currently driving the blue sedan behind you." The SUV's brake lights flashed again, longer this time. "What do you want?" Her voice had hardened. "Just a conversation. There's a rest stop 2 miles ahead. Pull in there. Come alone or the files I have get sent to every news outlet in the country." Another pause. "How do I know you won't release them anyway?" "Because we're all in law enforcement, Director. We understand discretion, and we have a simple request that cost you nothing but could save our careers." The silence stretched longer this time. Frank could almost hear her calculating her options. "Fine," she finally said. "The rest stop." 5 minutes, the line went dead. Frank looked at his colleagues. "She's in." The rest stop was deserted when they arrived, just as Frank had predicted. A small parking area with a shuttered seasonal food stand and picnic tables overlooking the ocean. The director's SUV was already there, parked at the far end. They could see her sitting inside alone. "No visible backup," Tom said, scanning the area. "But that doesn't mean they're not here." "We've come this far," Frank replied, grabbing a manila envelope from the glove compartment. "I'll do the talking. Watch for any movement." They approached the SUV cautiously. The driver's door opened, and Director Eleanor Hayes stepped out. In person, she was more imposing than her photos suggested. Tall and athletic, with short silver hair and piercing blue eyes that immediately fixed on Frank. She wore a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than Frank's monthly salary. "I assume you're the one who called," she said, her gaze moving between the 3 detectives. Frank nodded. "Thank you for meeting us, Director." "Cut the formalities," she snapped. "You said you have evidence." "Show me." Frank handed her the manila envelope. "Just copies. The originals are secure." Hayes opened the envelope and quickly scanned the contents. Photos of her meetings with Keller, transcripts of their recorded conversations, financial records showing the suspicious transfers. Her expression remained neutral, but Frank noticed a slight tightening around her eyes. "Interesting fiction you've compiled," she said, closing the envelope. "Doctored photos and fabricated recordings won't get you far." "They're not doctored," Liz interjected. "We both know that." Hayes turned her cool gaze to Liz. "And who exactly are you people?" "Boston PD," Frank answered. "Narcotics Division." "Ah." Hayes nodded, understanding dawning on her face. The group under Internal Affairs investigation. Detective Wilson, Detective Chen, and Detective Reynolds, I presume. Your reputation precedes you. Frank felt a chill run down his spine. She knew who they were. Had they underestimated her? Then you know why we're here, he said, keeping his voice steady. You want the investigation to disappear? Hayes stated flatly. You think I have that kind of influence with the Boston Police Department? We know you do, Tom said. One call from the FBI director suggesting these officers are valuable assets in an ongoing federal investigation would put everything on hold indefinitely. Hayes studied them for a long moment, the sound of waves crashing against the shoreline filling the silence. And if I refuse? She finally asked. Frank gestured to the envelope. Then by this time tomorrow, CNN, Fox News, and every newspaper in the country will be running stories about the FBI director taking bribes to protect a known criminal. Your career would be over before dinner. Hayes laughed, a short, sharp sound without humor. You three really don't understand what you're doing, do you? We understand perfectly, Frank replied. We're protecting ourselves. No, Hayes said, stepping closer. You're three dirty cops who crossed a line and now you're desperate. Desperate people make mistakes. Big ones. Despite her words, Frank noticed she kept the envelope clutched tightly in her hand. She was taking the threat seriously. Look, Frank said, softening his tone. We don't want money. We don't want to damage the Bureau. We just want to keep our jobs and stay out of prison. You make one phone call and these files stay buried forever. Everyone wins. Hayes was silent for several seconds, appearing to weigh her options. I'll need verification that these are your only copies, she finally said. You have our word, Frank replied. Hayes raised an eyebrow. The word of cops who plant evidence and steal drug money? Forgive me if I require something more substantial. What do you suggest? Liz asked. I need time to verify these materials and consider my options, Hayes said. 3 days. We meet again, same place, same time. I'll have an answer then. Frank exchanged glances with Tom and Liz. This wasn't part of the plan. They'd expected an immediate resolution. How do we know you won't use that time to come after us? Tom asked. You don't, Hayes replied simply. But I give you my word that no action will be taken against you before our next meeting. And unlike yours, my word still means something. The implied insult stung, but Frank recognized they had little choice. They'd made their move. Now they needed to see it through. 3 days, he agreed. But if we notice any unusual activity, you won't, Hayes interrupted. Now, if you'll excuse me, my sister is expecting me. Without waiting for a response, she returned to her SUV, taking the envelope with her. The 3 detectives watched as she drove away, disappearing around the bend in the road. Did that go as planned? Liz asked once they were back in their car. Frank stared at the empty road. Not exactly, but she's considering it. That's something. She seemed awfully confident for someone being blackmailed, Tom pointed out. What if she's playing us? She took the evidence with her, Frank countered. She's worried. She just doesn't want us to know it. The drive back to Boston was tense and mostly silent, each detective lost in their own thoughts about what the next 3 days might bring. Had they initiated a solution to their problems or accelerated their downfall? The uncertainty hung between them like a fog. Back at his apartment that evening, Frank poured himself a generous whiskey and tried to relax. The meeting replayed in his mind on a loop. Something about Hayes' demeanor bothered him. She hadn't seemed frightened or even particularly surprised, almost as if. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was an unknown number. Frank hesitated before answering. Detective Wilson, he said cautiously. Frank. The voice on the other end was familiar. Jack from Tech. We need to talk. Not on the phone. Meet me at Donovan's in 20 minutes. Come alone. The line went dead before Frank could respond. He stared at the phone, a knot forming in his stomach. Jack sounded scared. Had something gone wrong with the surveillance equipment? Had Hayes already made a move? 20 minutes later, Frank sat in a corner booth at Donovan's, a dimly lit bar frequented by cops from the precinct. Jack arrived 5 minutes late, his normally relaxed demeanor replaced by visible anxiety. He slid into the booth without ordering a drink. We have a problem, Jack said without preamble, his voice barely above a whisper. Someone accessed our secure server yesterday. They copied everything. The surveillance footage, the audio files, everything on Hayes. Frank felt the blood drain from his face. Who? I don't know, Jack admitted. But they were good. Really good. Left almost no trace. If I hadn't set up those extra security protocols, I would never have known. Could it have been Hayes? The FBI? Jack shook his head. Maybe, but it feels different. Look, I think you guys are in over your heads. Whatever you're planning with this evidence, it's better if you don't know the details, Frank interrupted. Fine, but I'm warning you. Someone else knows what you're doing, and they have copies of everything. Frank's mind raced. If someone else had their evidence, the whole plan could unravel. Hayes might not be their only problem. Can you find out who it was? Frank asked. I'm trying, Jack said. But these people, they're professionals. Better than me. He stood up to leave. Watch your back, Frank, all of you. After Jack left, Frank ordered another drink, his thoughts spiraling. He considered calling Liz and Tom, but decided against it. No point in panicking everyone until he knew more. Besides, they had committed now. There was no turning back. The next morning, Frank woke to a text message from an unknown number. Payment received. Standing by for further instructions. Frank stared at the message in confusion. He hadn't sent any payment to anyone. The message wasn't meant for him. But why had he received it? Unless a cold realization washed over him. What if Hayes was setting them up? What if she was creating a paper trail that made it look like they were involved in something even more sinister than blackmail? Frank quickly called Tom, who answered on the first ring. Did you get a strange text this morning? Frank asked without greeting. About a payment? Yeah, Tom sounded as confused as Frank felt. Liz, too. What the hell is going on? I don't know, Frank admitted. But I think Hayes is playing her own game. We need to be careful, very careful. We should abort, Tom suggested. It's not too late to back out, but Frank knew it was. They had shown their hand to the FBI director. There was no walking away now. We stick to the plan, he said firmly. Meet me at my place at noon. We need to prepare for the next meeting. And Tom, don't trust anyone outside the three of us, not even Jack. As Frank ended the call, he walked to his window and peered out at the street below. Was that car with tinted windows there yesterday? Was the man reading a newspaper on the bench across the street really interested in the daily news? Or was he watching Frank's building? Paranoia was setting in. But in their situation, paranoia might be the only thing keeping them alive. Frank closed the blinds and began preparing for their next move. Hayes had given them 3 days. He intended to use every minute to make sure they weren't walking into a trap. The game had changed. It was no longer just about saving their careers. Now it was about surviving what they had started. Eleanor Hayes sat alone in her hotel suite. The contents of the manila envelope spread across the desk before her. Outside, Boston's lights twinkled against the night sky, but her attention remained fixed on the evidence the detectives had compiled. She had to admit it was thorough. The photos weren't doctored as she had claimed. The audio recordings were genuine. They had her dead to rights, and that was exactly according to plan. She reached for her secure phone and dialed a number from memory. After 2 rings, a man answered. Status? The voice was crisp, professional. Phase 1 complete, Hayes replied. They made contact exactly as predicted. 3 Boston detectives, Wilson, Chen, and Reynolds. The surveillance team confirms the same, the man responded. How much do they know? Enough to be dangerous if this were real, Hayes said, picking up one of the photos. It showed her meeting with Joseph Keller at a private club. They have the meetings, the financial records, the lot. Of course, they've completely misinterpreted everything. That was the point, the man reminded her. Operation Clean Sweep has been in motion for 18 months. These 3 were among the first to show up on our radar. Hayes nodded to herself. Clean Sweep had been her brainchild. A nationwide operation to identify and remove corrupt officers from law enforcement agencies across the country. The Boston group wasn't even the main target, just a small fish in a very big pond, but they had proven useful. What's your assessment of them? The man asked. Desperate, Hayes replied. Wilson is the ringleader, smart but overconfident. Chen seems reluctant but committed. Reynolds is following along. Probably has the most to lose personally. The technical team reports they accessed all the planted files, including the false account numbers. Good, Hayes said. Phase 2 begins tomorrow. I've given them 3 days to sweat. We'll meet again at the same location. The team will be in position. Surveillance is already on all 3 subjects. Hayes ended the call and gathered the evidence back into the envelope. She walked to the window looking out at the city below. Somewhere out there, 3 corrupt detectives thought they were playing her. They had no idea they'd been pawns in her game for months. She had personally overseen the creation of the evidence they'd discovered. The meetings with Keller, a trusted FBI informant playing his part to perfection. The financial transactions, carefully constructed by the Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit, all of it designed to tempt corrupt officers into revealing themselves. Hayes allowed herself a small smile. After 30 years in law enforcement, 15 as a prosecutor before joining the Bureau, she had seen every kind of corruption imaginable. These 3 were hardly unique. Cops who started cutting corners for what they believed were good reasons, then found themselves unable to stop. Her hotel room phone rang, the front desk informing her that her dinner had arrived. As she ate, Hayes reviewed the psychological profiles of the 3 detectives one more time. Understanding their motivations was crucial for the next phase. Wilson had a hero complex, believed he was above the law because he was bringing down bad guys. Chen was close to retirement, looking to protect her pension. Reynolds had a daughter with a rare medical condition, expensive treatments that his insurance didn't fully cover. Hayes didn't enjoy entrapping them. But corruption in law enforcement was a cancer that had to be cut out, no matter how sympathetic the reasons behind it might sometimes be. The next morning, Hayes met with her Boston-based team in a secure room at the field office. 10 agents, all hand-picked for this operation, gathered around the conference table. "They've taken the bait," she began without preamble. "Now we move to phase 2. I want continuous surveillance on all 3. Monitor their communications, their movements, everything. Agent Cooper, what's the status on their internal affairs investigation?" A younger agent looked up from his tablet. "We've coordinated with Boston PD. The IA investigation is proceeding, but at a deliberately slow pace. They're building a solid case against all 3 subjects." "Good." Hayes nodded. "Let's make sure nothing interferes with that. These detectives need to face the full consequences of their actions, both past and present." "What about their tech guy?" another agent asked. "This Jack from their IT department." "Bring him in today," Hayes ordered. "Quietly. I want to know exactly what he did to help them, and what else he might be involved in. Offer him immunity in exchange for full cooperation." The meeting continued for another hour as they finalized the details for the next phase. By the time Hayes left the field office, the trap was fully set. Meanwhile, Frank Wilson paced his living room, occasionally glancing out the window at the street below. Tom and Liz sat on his couch, both looking as sleep-deprived as he felt. "I still think this whole thing feels wrong," Liz said. Hayes was too calm, too in control. "She's the FBI director," Frank replied. "Of course she's in control. It's her job." "No," Liz shook her head. "This is different. She didn't even try to deny the evidence. Just called it fiction and then took it with her anyway." Tom leaned forward. "What if she's recording our meetings? Building a case against us?" "For what?" Frank asked. "Blackmail." "Sure, but then she'd have to explain what we were blackmailing her about. The evidence goes both ways." "Unless the evidence isn't real," Liz said quietly. Frank stopped pacing. "What are you talking about?" "I've been thinking about it," Liz continued. "We found those files too easily. The encryption was complex but not impossible. What if we were meant to find them?" A heavy silence fell over the room as the 3 detectives considered the possibility. "That's insane," Frank finally said, but with less conviction than before. "Why would the FBI director set herself up like that?" "To catch corrupt cops?" Tom suggested. "Wouldn't be the first time the feds ran a sting operation." Frank shook his head. "No, if that were the case, we'd already be in custody. They wouldn't need this whole 3-day waiting period. Unless they're watching us," Liz pressed. "Seeing what we do, who we contact. Maybe they're after bigger fish and we're just the bait." "You're being paranoid," Frank insisted, but doubt had crept into his voice. His phone rang, cutting through the tension. It was Jack. "Frank," Jack's voice was hushed, urgent. "I can't talk long. They brought me in." "The FBI." Frank's blood ran cold. "What? When?" "This morning. They know everything, Frank. About the surveillance equipment, the encrypted communications, all of it." "Did you tell them about us?" Frank demanded. "I had no choice," Jack replied. "They already knew. They offered me immunity if I cooperated." "Jesus, Jack, listen to me," Jack interrupted. "That's not what you think. Hayes, the meetings with Keller, all of it, it's an operation. Has been from the start. They called it clean sweep. Frank felt the floor tilt beneath him. What are you saying? The files you found were planted. The whole thing is a sting to identify corrupt officers. You guys walked right into it. A pause. I'm sorry, Frank, I have to go. The line went dead. Frank lowered the phone, his mind racing. What is it? Liz asked, alarmed by his expression. Frank relayed Jack's message. The three detectives stared at each other, the full weight of their situation crashing down on them. We need to run, Tom said, already standing. If this is true, they'll be coming for us soon. Run where? Liz challenged. They're the FBI, we won't get far. What about the evidence we have on Hayes? Frank argued. If we release it, didn't you hear what Jack said? Liz cut him off. It's not real evidence. It's a setup. We release it and we just look like idiots. Desperate, corrupt idiots. Frank sank into a chair, his mind working furiously. Maybe we can turn this around. If Hayes is running an operation, she must have authorization. Resources. That means there's a paper trail. So? Tom asked. So maybe we can find it, Frank said. Proof that she manufactured evidence to entrap us. That's illegal. Grounds for dismissal of any case against us. And how exactly do we do that? Liz asked skeptically. We need to get into her email, her communications with her team, Frank replied. Jack might help us. Jack just turned on us, Tom reminded him. Maybe not completely, Frank said. He warned us, didn't he? He could have just let us walk into the trap. The three fell silent, weighing their limited options. I have a cousin in the U.S. Attorney's office, Liz finally said. If this is a sanctioned operation, there would be records there. I could ask her to look discreetly. Do it, Frank nodded. Tom, try to get in touch with Jack again. See if he'll help us access Hayes' communications. And you? Tom asked. I'm going to prepare for our meeting with Hayes, Frank said grimly. In case everything else fails, we need to be ready to confront her. As his colleagues left, Frank remained in his living room, the reality of their situation sinking in. If Jack was right, they had never been the hunters, always the prey. Hayes had played them masterfully, but Frank wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Across town, in a nondescript surveillance van, 2 FBI agents monitored the live feed from the hidden cameras in Frank's apartment. They had heard every word. Sir, one agent spoke into his comm. They're making moves. Wilson is planning to counter. Let them, came the calm reply from Hayes. That's exactly what we want. Keep the surveillance tight, but don't intervene unless absolutely necessary. The next day passed in a blur of desperate activity. Liz reached out to her cousin but received no useful information. Her cousin was too cautious to access files outside her clearance. Tom tried repeatedly to contact Jack, only to discover that the tech officer had been moved to a secure location for his own protection. Frank, meanwhile, devised what he believed was their best defense, a complete confession of their own misdeeds, coupled with accusations about Hayes' illegal entrapment operation. It was a Hail Mary, but it was all they had left. On the morning of their scheduled meeting with Hayes, the 3 detectives gathered one last time in Frank's apartment. Remember the plan, Frank said, handing each of them a sealed envelope. If anything happens to any of us, the others mail these to the press, the police commissioner, and the attorney general. Full confession of what we did, but also details of Hayes' operation. Do you really think that will protect us? Liz asked. No, Frank admitted. But it might force them to cut a deal instead of making an example of us. As they prepared to leave, Tom's phone pinged with a message. His face went pale as he read it. What? Frank asked. It's from my wife, Tom said, his voice shaking. FBI agents just came to our house. They're taking her in for questioning about financial irregularities in our accounts. They're moving, Liz said, checking her own phone. My bank accounts have been frozen. Pending investigation. Frank felt the walls closing in. Hayes wasn't waiting for their meeting. She was already dismantling their lives piece by piece. We stick to the plan, he insisted, though his confidence was crumbling. We meet Hayes, we confront her with what we know, and we offer our terms. Terms? Liz laughed bitterly. Frank, we have nothing to offer. No leverage. No cards to play. We have the truth, Frank said firmly, and sometimes that's enough. The drive to the coastal rest stop was tense, each detective lost in thoughts of what awaited them. When they arrived, Hayes' black SUV was already there. This time, however, it was accompanied by 3 other identical vehicles. Backup, Tom noted grimly. She's not taking chances. Neither are we, Frank replied, patting his jacket pocket where he'd placed a small recording device. Every word of their conversation would be captured. They parked and approached Hayes, who stood alone by the picnic tables overlooking the ocean. The wind whipped her silver hair as she watched them approach, her expression unreadable. Right on time, she noted. I appreciate punctuality. Cut the pleasantries, Frank said coldly. We know about Operation Clean Sweep. We know the evidence was planted. This whole thing was a setup from the beginning. If Hayes was surprised by their knowledge, she didn't show it. Very good, Detective Wilson. Yes, the operation has been ongoing for some time, targeting corrupt officers across multiple jurisdictions. That's illegal, Frank argued. Entrapment. Hayes raised an eyebrow. Is it? We created a scenario, yes. But you three chose to commit blackmail, just as you previously chose to plant evidence, steal money, and violate the oath you swore to uphold. We're not here to debate our actions, Liz cut in. We're here to negotiate. Negotiate? Hayes sounded almost amused. I'm afraid you misunderstand the situation. This isn't a negotiation. It's a courtesy meeting before formal charges are filed. If you charge us, Frank countered, everything becomes public. The operation, the manufactured evidence, all of it. It won't look good for the Bureau. True, Hayes nodded. But tell me, Detective Wilson, which do you think the public will care about more? The FBI running an operation to catch corrupt cops or the corrupt cops themselves? The three detectives exchanged glances, the gravity of their situation becoming clearer by the moment. What happens now? Tom finally asked. Hayes gestured toward the waiting SUVs where agents had begun to emerge. Now you're taken into custody. Formal charges will be filed tomorrow. The evidence against you is substantial, not just from our operation but from the internal affairs investigation that was already underway. And if we cooperate? Liz asked quietly. Then perhaps some leniency might be possible, Hayes replied, particularly if you can provide information about others involved in similar activities. Frank laughed bitterly. You want us to turn on our colleagues? Become informants? I want justice, Detective Wilson, Hayes corrected him. How it comes about is up to you. As the FBI agents approached, Frank made one last desperate attempt. The evidence you planted, Keller, the meetings, the financial transfers, what was that all about? Was any of it real? For the first time, Hayes's composure slipped slightly. A flash of something, surprise, concern, crossed her face before she regained control. That's classified, she said simply, and irrelevant to your situation. But Frank had seen it, that momentary reaction. There was something there, something beyond the sting operation, a loose thread that, if pulled, might unravel in unexpected ways. Before he could pursue it further, the agents reached them. Frank Wilson, Liz Chen, Tom Reynolds, one announced formally. You're under arrest for corruption, evidence tampering, theft of seized assets, and attempted blackmail of a federal officer. As they were led away in handcuffs, Frank looked back at Hayes, who was already walking toward her SUV. The operation had succeeded, they were caught. But Frank couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than a simple sting. In the back of the FBI vehicle, as Tom and Liz sat in stunned silence beside him, Frank made a mental note of the date and every detail of their conversation with Hayes. Someday, he would understand what had really happened here, and maybe, just maybe, he would find a way to use that knowledge. For now, though, their careers, and quite possibly their freedom, were over. 3 days had passed since their arrest. 3 days of separate holding cells, interrogations, and mounting despair. For Liz Chen, the reality of their situation had fully set in. 30 years on the force, retirement just months away. And now this, facing federal charges that would likely send her to prison for years. She sat across from her court-appointed attorney in a sterile interview room at the Federal Detention Center. The lawyer, a young woman named Walsh who looked barely out of law school, flipped through the case file with a grim expression. They have everything, Detective Chen, Walsh said, looking up from the papers. Recordings of your conversations planning the blackmail, documentation of previous misconduct, financial records showing unexplained deposits to your accounts. The evidence is overwhelming. Liz stared at her folded hands. What am I looking at? Best case? 5 years with cooperation. Worst case? Walsh hesitated. 15 to 20. The words hit Liz like a physical blow. 20 years. She'd be in her 70s when released. What about the others? Wilson and Reynolds. I don't know the specifics of their cases, Walsh replied. But I imagine they're facing similar charges. Maybe worse for Wilson since he appears to have been the ringleader. Liz nodded slowly. Frank had led them into this mess with his overconfidence and schemes. But she had followed willingly enough. They all had. The prosecutors have offered a deal, Walsh continued, sliding a document across the table. In exchange for your full cooperation and testimony against Wilson and Reynolds, they'll recommend a reduced sentence. 3 years, possibly less with good behavior. They want me to turn on my partners, Liz said flatly. They want the truth, Walsh corrected. Look, I've been doing this long enough to know when someone's being offered a lifeline. This is yours. I strongly advise you to take it. Liz picked up the document, scanning the terms. Cooperation, full disclosure. Testimony before a grand jury. Betrayal wrapped in legal language. Can I think about it? She asked. Walsh gathered her papers. 24 hours. After that, the deal comes off the table. After the lawyer left, Liz remained in the interview room, permission granted for a brief moment of solitude before returning to her cell. Her thoughts drifted to Frank and Tom. Were they being offered similar deals? Would one of them break first? The door opened, and to Liz's surprise, Director Hayes herself walked in. She dismissed the guard with a nod and took the seat across from Liz. Detective Chen, Hayes said, her voice neutral. I thought we should talk. Liz straightened, instinctively defensive. About what? You've already won. This isn't about winning, Hayes replied. It's about justice. And perhaps redemption. Redemption? Liz couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. Is that what you're offering with this deal? Turn on my friends in exchange for a few years off my sentence? Hayes studied her for a moment. You're an intelligent woman, detective. 28 years on the force, commendations for bravery, exemplary record until... She gestured at the file. Until things changed. I'm curious, when did it start? When did you first cross the line? Liz considered refusing to answer, but what was the point now? 3 years ago, she said quietly. A drug bust in Dorchester. We found more cash than was reported in the evidence log. Tom, Detective Reynolds, his daughter needed specialized treatment their insurance wouldn't cover. It was just supposed to be that one time. Hayes nodded, unsurprised. It usually starts that way. For a good reason. Then it becomes easier. The justifications change. Are you here to lecture me on ethics? Liz asked sharply. No, Hayes replied. I'm here because I believe you're different from Wilson. You got caught up in something that spiraled, but you're not corrupt at your core. Your hesitation during the blackmail attempt was noted by our surveillance team. Liz felt a chill. How long had they been watched? How much did the FBI really know? What do you want from me? She asked directly. Hayes leaned forward. The truth about Joseph Keller. The request caught Liz off guard. Keller? The man from the manufactured evidence you planted. What about him? What if I told you not all of the evidence was manufactured? Hayes said, her voice dropping lower. What if Keller was real, and some of those meetings actually took place? Liz stared at the FBI director, trying to process this new information. I don't understand. Are you saying there really was corruption? I'm saying Operation Clean Sweep had multiple objectives, Hayes explained carefully. Yes, it was designed to identify corrupt officers, but it was also tracking something else, something potentially far more dangerous. And now I need to know exactly what Wilson discovered and who else he might have told. Liz's mind raced. Frank had been obsessed with the files, spending hours analyzing them, following leads that he sometimes didn't even share with her and Tom. Had he found something real among the planted evidence? I don't know, Liz admitted. Frank kept some things to himself. Said it was safer that way. Hayes looked disappointed but not surprised. Think carefully, Detective Chen. Anything he mentioned about Keller beyond what was in those files? Any contacts he made that seemed unusual? This isn't just about your case anymore. Why are you telling me this? Liz asked suspiciously. Because I need allies, even unlikely ones, Hayes replied. And because your cooperation on this matter could significantly impact the terms of your deal. Liz felt the first stirring of hope, a bargaining chip she hadn't realized she possessed. I want full immunity. No prison time. Hayes shook her head. Not possible. You still committed serious crimes, but I could arrange for house arrest instead of prison, and protection for you and your family. Protection from what? From whoever Keller is working with, Hayes said grimly. People who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate loose ends. The implication was clear. This was bigger and more dangerous than Liz had imagined. She thought of her retirement plans, her small house on the coast of Maine, the grandchildren she had hoped to spend time with. All seemingly lost now. Unless, I need time to think, she said. You have until tomorrow. Hayes stood to leave. For what it's worth, Detective Chen, I believe you got caught up in something that began with good intentions. That doesn't excuse your actions, but it does make your situation understandable. After Hayes left, Liz sat motionless, her mind whirling with new possibilities and dangers. She had a choice to make, loyalty to her partners or a chance at some kind of future for herself. Across the detention center, Tom Reynolds faced his own moment of truth. His attorney, a public defender named Gonzalez, had just outlined a similar deal. Cooperate against Wilson and Chen, receive a reduced sentence. What about my family? Tom asked, his voice hoarse from hours of interrogation. My daughter's treatments? Gonzalez sighed sympathetically. The FBI has frozen your assets pending investigation. However, they've indicated that certain medical expenses for your daughter could continue to be covered if you cooperate. Tom clenched his fists under the table. They were using his daughter as leverage, his greatest vulnerability. The daughter whose medical needs had driven him to cross lines he'd never imagined crossing. I need to speak with my wife, he said. That can be arranged, Gonzalez replied, but only after you've made your decision on the deal. They're not giving you much time. Tom closed his eyes briefly, the weight of his choices crushing down on him. He had followed Frank out of desperation and friendship. Now those same bonds might condemn him to years away from his family, away from the daughter who needed him. What would you do? He asked his lawyer. Gonzalez hesitated, then answered honestly. If it were my family, I'd take the deal. Your loyalty to your partners is admirable, but your primary responsibility is to your wife and daughter. Tom nodded slowly. The decision was forming in his mind, a painful one but increasingly clear. Meanwhile, in yet another part of the facility, Frank Wilson paced his small cell. Unlike his colleagues, he had refused to meet with prosecutors or consider any deals. His court-appointed attorney had called him stubborn and self-destructive. Frank preferred to think of it as principled. A guard appeared at his cell door. Wilson, you have a visitor. Frank was led to an interview room where, to his surprise, Jack from Tech waited. The young IT officer looked uncomfortable, avoiding Frank's eyes as he entered. They said I could talk to you, Jack said as the guard left them alone. Part of my cooperation agreement. Come to gloat? Frank asked bitterly, taking a seat across from him. No, Jack shook his head. To warn you, and maybe to help if I can. Frank studied the younger man's face, looking for signs of deception. Why would you help me? You already sold us out. I didn't have a choice, Jack protested. They had everything on me. The equipment I provided, the system breaches, all of it. But that's not why I'm here. He leaned forward, lowering his voice despite the room being secure. There's something wrong with this whole operation, Frank. Things don't add up. Frank's interest was piqued despite his anger. What do you mean? The resources they deployed for this sting. It's way beyond what you'd expect for a few corrupt cops in Boston. Multiple teams, surveillance equipment that even I've never seen before, direct involvement from the FBI director herself. Jack shook his head. It's like using a tactical nuke to kill a cockroach. Frank had wondered the same thing. Why would Hayes personally oversee such an operation? There's more, Jack continued. While I was cooperating, I got access to some of their systems. Most of the files were encrypted or restricted, but I managed to glimpse a few things. The operation wasn't just about corrupt cops. There was another name that kept coming up, Orion. Orion. Frank repeated. What is that, a person? An organization? I don't know, Jack admitted. But whatever it is, it scared them. High-level clearance, need-to-know basis only. Frank's mind worked furiously, connecting dots. And how does this help me? Information is leverage, Jack replied. If I were you, I'd ask Hayes about Orion, see how she reacts. It might give you something to bargain with. Why are you telling me this? Frank asked suspiciously. Jack finally met his eyes. Because despite everything, you were good to me when no one else at the precinct was. And because something about this whole situation feels wrong, I don't think any of us knows the full story here. After Jack left, Frank lay on his cell bunk, staring at the ceiling and thinking, Orion. The name meant nothing to him, but if Jack was right, it meant something to Hayes. And if Hayes had secrets she wanted to protect. The next morning, all three detectives made their decisions. Tom Reynolds signed the cooperation agreement, his daughter's welfare ultimately outweighing all other considerations. He provided detailed statements about the team's corruption and the blackmail attempt, though he maintained that he had been a reluctant participant pressured by Wilson. Liz Chen took the modified deal Hayes had offered. House arrest instead of prison, in exchange for both her testimony against Wilson and her assistance in investigating what Frank might have discovered about Keller. She told Hayes everything she could remember about Frank's investigation methods, the additional research he had conducted, and the few hints he had dropped about bigger players behind the scenes. Frank Wilson, however, surprised everyone. He requested a direct meeting with Hayes. No lawyers, no prosecutors, just the two of them. The meeting was arranged for that afternoon in a secure room at the Federal Building. When Hayes entered, Frank was already seated at the table, handcuffed but composed. "Detective Wilson?" Hayes nodded as she took her seat. "I understand you wanted to speak with me." "I do," Frank replied calmly. "About Orion." Hayes's expression didn't change, but Frank noticed her posture stiffen slightly. "I'm not familiar with what you're referring to." "I think you are," Frank countered. "And I think it's the real reason behind Operation Clean Sweep. Keller works for Orion, doesn't he? The meetings in those files, some of them were real." "These are serious allegations, Detective," Hayes said carefully. "And completely unfounded, are they?" Frank leaned forward. "Then why deploy such extensive resources to catch 3 corrupt detectives? Why personal involvement from the FBI director? It doesn't make sense unless there was something bigger at stake." Hayes was silent for a moment, assessing him. "What exactly do you think you know?" "Not enough," Frank admitted. "But I know Keller isn't just some businessman. The financial transfers in those files, they weren't all fake, were they? Some of that money is real, going somewhere it shouldn't. And I think you're investigating it, but you can't move openly because you don't know how far the corruption extends." Hayes stood abruptly. "This meeting is over. You'll be returned to your cell." "I can help you," Frank said quickly. "Whatever Orion is, I can help you find it. I have resources, contacts you don't. People who would talk to a disgraced cop but never to the FBI." "In exchange for what?" Hayes asked, though she remained standing. "Immunity for me and my partners," Frank replied without hesitation. "Full protection for Reynolds' family, and a chance to do something right for once." Hayes studied him for a long moment. "You don't even know what you're offering to help with." "I know it's important," Frank said. "Important enough that you'll consider my offer instead of dismissing it outright." "Your partners have already turned on you," Hayes informed him coldly. "Both have signed cooperation agreements. Reynolds will testify that you were the ringleader, that you pressured him into participating. Chen has agreed to help us understand what you might have discovered about Keller." The news struck Frank like a physical blow, though he tried not to show it. Tom and Liz had broken. He was alone. "My offer stands," he said, his voice steady despite the betrayal burning in his chest. "Immunity for all 3 of us. Whatever they've agreed to. I know you can override it if this Orion thing is as big as I think it is." Hayes walked to the door but paused before opening it. "I'll consider your proposal, Detective Wilson. In the meantime, you might want to rethink your strategy of refusing all cooperation. The prosecutors are pushing for the maximum sentence in your case." After she left, Frank was escorted back to his cell. He sat on the edge of his bunk, feeling the walls of his future closing in. His partners had abandoned him. His career was over, his freedom likely forfeit for years to come. But he had seen Hayes' reaction to the name Orion. There was something there, something important enough that she hadn't immediately rejected his offer. It was a thin thread of hope, but it was all he had. That evening, Frank received another visitor, this time a stern-faced man in his 50s who introduced himself simply as Agent Harper. "Director Hayes asked me to speak with you," Harper said without preamble. "About your proposal." Frank straightened, alert now. "And if, and this is a significant if, you have information that could help our investigation into certain matters. There might be some flexibility regarding your situation." "I want full immunity for all 3 of us." Frank repeated his terms. "In writing." Harper shook his head. "That's not possible. The most we can offer is a reduced sentence for you, in a minimum security facility in exchange for your cooperation. Your partners have made their own arrangements. Not good enough, Frank said firmly. Whatever Orion is, it's big enough that Hayes sent you here despite my partners already flipping. That means you need something only I have. Harper's expression hardened. You're overplaying your hand, Detective. You don't have the leverage you think you do. Let me speak to Hayes again, Frank insisted. Directly. The director has more important matters to attend to than negotiating with a corrupt officer facing multiple federal charges. Then we have nothing more to discuss, Frank replied. Leaning back in his chair, send me back to my cell. Harper studied him for a moment, then stood. I'll convey your response, but I strongly suggest you reconsider. This offer won't remain open indefinitely. After Harper left, Frank lay back on his bunk, staring at the ceiling again. He was gambling everything on his hunch about Orion, whatever it was. If he was wrong, he faced years in prison. If he was right, well, that remained to be seen. The next morning, he was surprised to be led not back to an interview room but to a transport vehicle. No explanation was given as he was handcuffed and placed in the back. After a 30-minute drive, they arrived at what appeared to be a private airfield. A sleek government jet waited on the tarmac. Standing beside it was Director Hayes. As Frank was led toward her, he felt a mixture of vindication and apprehension. His gamble had paid off, at least enough to get Hayes's attention again. Now came the hard part, leveraging that attention into something that could save him and, if possible, his former partners. Detective Wilson, Hayes greeted him as the guard stopped a few feet away. I've reconsidered your offer. It seems we might have mutual interests after all. Does that mean we have a deal? Frank asked cautiously. It means we're going to have a longer conversation, Hayes replied, gesturing toward the waiting jet. About Orion, about Joseph Keller, and about exactly what you think you know and how you can help us. Frank looked at the jet, then back at Hayes. Where are we going? Somewhere secure, Hayes said simply. Somewhere we can talk freely about matters of national security. After that conversation, Detective Wilson, we'll see what kind of deal might be possible. As Frank was escorted up the steps into the aircraft, he felt a strange mix of emotions. Fear of the unknown situation he was entering, anger at the partners who had betrayed him, hope that he might yet find a way out of this mess, and beneath it all, a growing certainty that whatever Orion was, it was about to change everything. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harrison entered. Everyone rose, prosecutors, defense attorneys, spectators, and the three defendants themselves. Frank Wilson stood with his back straight, eyes forward, refusing to look at Tom Reynolds and Liz Chen beside him. After everything that had happened, he still couldn't bring himself to face his former partners. Be seated, the judge instructed, settling behind the bench and adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the documents before him. We're here today for sentencing in the case of United States versus Wilson, Chen, and Reynolds. He looked up, surveying the three former detectives. Before I pronounce sentence, would any of the defendants like to make a statement? Tom Reynolds spoke first, his voice wavering slightly. Your Honor, I've cooperated fully with the prosecution and accepted responsibility for my actions. I betrayed my oath as a police officer, and I'll carry that shame forever. All I can say is that I lost my way trying to provide for my family, but that's no excuse for what I did. I'm deeply sorry for the damage I've caused to the public trust. Liz Chen went next, her normally confident demeanor subdued. I spent 28 years upholding the law before I broke it. Nothing can justify that betrayal. I only ask the court to consider that my cooperation has helped expose corruption beyond just our actions. Finally, it was Frank's turn. He stood feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom. Your Honor, unlike my former colleagues, I won't offer excuses or apologies. The full truth of what happened is known to very few people in this room, and that's how it will remain. I accept the consequences of my actions, whatever they may be. Judge Harrison nodded, then picked up a document. Very well. In the case of Thomas Reynolds, having pled guilty to lesser charges of evidence tampering and misappropriation of seized assets, and in light of your substantial cooperation, this court sentences you to 3 years in federal prison, with eligibility for parole after 18 months. Additionally, the court notes the special arrangement regarding continued medical coverage for your dependent. Tom sagged visibly with relief. 3 years was better than the decade or more he might have faced. In the case of Elizabeth Chen, having pled guilty to similar charges and provided cooperation of significant value to ongoing federal investigations, this court sentences you to 2 years of house arrest with electronic monitoring, followed by 3 years of probation. You are permanently barred from any law enforcement or security position. Frank noted the substantial difference in their sentences. Hayes had kept her word to Liz, arranging for house arrest instead of prison time. The special deal they'd made about Keller had paid off for her. Finally, in the case of Frank Wilson, the judge continued, his tone noticeably cooler, as ringleader of this corruption and the primary instigator of the attempted blackmail of a federal officer, and despite your eventual cooperation in certain matters, this court sentences you to 8 years in federal prison, with eligibility for parole after serving 5 years. 8 years. Frank had expected worse. Much worse, given what had happened after that plane ride with Hayes. He accepted the sentence with a slight nod, his face betraying nothing. "This court is adjourned," Judge Harrison declared, bringing down his gavel. As the bailiffs approached to take Frank into custody, he finally turned to look at his former partners. Tom wouldn't meet his eyes, staring fixedly at the floor, but Liz held his gaze, a complex mixture of guilt, regret, and understanding passing between them. No words were spoken. None were needed. 6 months later, Frank sat in the visitors area of the minimum security federal prison that had become his home. Despite the reduced security level, another part of his arrangement with Hayes, it was still prison. Still a cage, no matter how relatively comfortable. The door opened and Frank straightened as Director Eleanor Hayes herself walked in. She dismissed the guard with a nod and took the seat across from him. "You're looking well, Wilson," she observed, studying him. "Prison agrees with you." "Let's skip the pleasantries," Frank replied. "You didn't come all this way for small talk." Hayes smiled thinly. "Direct as always, fine. I came to update you on certain matters and to check if you've had any insight since our last conversation." Frank leaned back in his chair, considering how much to say. His deal with Hayes was complex. His cooperation in the Orion investigation in exchange for reduced sentences for all 3 detectives and protection for their families. A deal made on that private jet and in the secure facility that followed, where Frank had shared everything he'd pieced together about Keller's real operations. "Keller's disappeared," Frank stated rather than asked. "Your surveillance lost him in Europe somewhere." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Your sources are still active, even from in here. Impressive." Frank shrugged. "People talk. Guards other inmates with connections. I listen." "Yes, Keller has gone underground," Hayes confirmed. After the arrest of his associates in Boston and Chicago, he apparently decided to cut his losses. "But Orion continues," Frank said. "It wasn't a question. Unfortunately, yes. The operation was larger than even we anticipated. Keller was just one component, a significant one, but replaceable." Frank nodded slowly. "Orion, the code name for a network of corruption that extended through multiple law enforcement agencies, financial institutions, and even into the government itself. A shadow organization that had been skimming money from drug seizures, redirecting investigations, and protecting certain criminal enterprises for years. The very thing Frank and his partners had inadvertently stumbled into with their own small-scale corruption." "And my former partners?" Frank asked, though he already knew much of the answer. "Reynolds is serving his time without incident. His daughter's treatments continue to be covered, as agreed. Chen's house arrest is proceeding smoothly. She's been particularly helpful in identifying potential Orion connections within the Boston PD." Frank absorbed this information silently. Their betrayal still stung, but he had made peace with it. In their position, he might have done the same. "And the internal investigation? The one that started all this?" "Officially closed," Hayes replied. "The corrupt officers have been caught and punished. Justice has been served." Her tone made it clear what she thought of that simplified narrative. "Except we both know it hasn't," Frank said quietly. "Orion is still out there, still operating. Keller will be replaced. Nothing really changes." "That's not entirely true," Hayes countered. "We've identified 17 Orion-connected individuals across 3 cities. 8 have been arrested. The others are under surveillance. It's slow work, but we're making progress." "Not fast enough," Frank argued. "Not while you're playing by rules they ignore." Hayes studied him for a moment. "Are you suggesting an alternative approach, Wilson?" Because I should remind you that your current accommodations are considerably more comfortable than they might have been. That can change. Frank met her gaze without flinching. I'm suggesting that you need someone who understands how they think. Someone who can anticipate their moves because he's made similar ones. Someone like you, Hayes stated flatly. Someone exactly like me, Frank confirmed. I've had 6 months in here to think, to remember every detail of what we found about Keller and his operation. I've made connections you haven't. And what would you want in exchange for this? Expertise. Frank leaned forward. A transfer. Not freedom, I know that's not on the table, but a transfer to a facility where I can be more useful, one with better access to information, communications. Hayes considered this. You understand that any arrangement would come with strict oversight. You'd be helping us identify Orion operatives, not running your own investigation. I understand, Frank nodded. But I want one more thing. Of course you do, Hayes said dryly. Protection for Chen and Reynolds after I'm transferred. Orion has a long reach. If they connect my partners to whatever new arrangement we make, they'll become targets. Hayes seemed mildly surprised. You still care about their welfare even after they turned on you? Frank shrugged. We were partners for years. That doesn't just disappear no matter what happened. Besides, they have families. I don't. After a moment, Hayes nodded. I believe that can be arranged. I'll have the paperwork drawn up for your transfer to a special facility in Virginia. Officially, you'll still be serving your sentence. Unofficially, I'll be hunting Orion, Frank finished for her. With supervision, Hayes emphasized. This isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card, Wilson. You're still a convicted criminal serving time. But serving it usefully, Frank noted. That's all I'm asking for. A chance to do something right for once. As Hayes left, Frank remained in the visitors' area, allowed a few minutes of solitude before returning to his cell. Through the window he could see the prison yard, inmates exercising or talking in small groups, men like him, who had broken the law and been caught. The difference was most of them would serve their time and return to the same lives, the same temptations. Frank knew he never would. Whether hunting Orion from a special facility in Virginia or serving his full 8 years here, his old life was gone forever. His career was destroyed, his reputation shattered, his partners lost to him. All because of choices he had made, lines he had crossed. In a strange way, he felt more purpose now than he had in years. Helping to take down Orion wouldn't erase his crimes, but it might give meaning to his punishment, a chance at some kind of redemption, however small. 2 weeks later, Frank was transferred to the special facility in Virginia. It looked like a prison from the outside. Walls, guard towers, barbed wire, but inside portions of it had been converted into a secure intelligence operation. His new cell was similar to his old one, but he now had access to a workspace for several hours each day. A room with computers, files, and boards where he could map the connections of Orion alongside a small team of FBI analysts. The work was slow and often frustrating. Orion had operated in shadows for years, careful to leave few traces. But Frank's unique perspective, his understanding of how corrupt officers thought and operated, proved valuable. Within 3 months, they had identified 2 more Orion-connected judges who had been redirecting cases away from Keller's associates. Meanwhile, Tom Reynolds adapted to prison life as best he could. His shorter sentence made the time more bearable, and knowing his daughter's treatments were continuing gave him peace of mind. He still struggled with guilt, not just for his crimes, but for turning on Frank. Despite everything, Frank had ultimately secured him a better deal than he would have received otherwise. A debt Tom wasn't sure he could ever repay. Liz Chen's house arrest allowed her to maintain some semblance of normal life. She could see her family, though her reputation in the community was destroyed. She worked remotely as a consultant for the FBI's Orion Task Force, reviewing case files for patterns that might indicate Orion influence. It wasn't the retirement she had planned, but it was better than a prison cell. 1 year into Frank's sentence, the first major breakthrough came. A financial analyst on their team discovered a pattern in offshore accounts linked to seized asset funds, the signature of Orion's money laundering operation. Following the money led to the identification of the organization's financial hub and several key members. Hayes visited Frank again after the arrests that followed. This time, her usual cool demeanor showed cracks of genuine satisfaction. 7 arrests across 3 states, she reported, sitting across from him in the secure meeting room, including 2 federal judges and an assistant director at the DEA, all Orion connections that we can prove. Frank nodded, allowing himself a small smile. The money trail was always going to be their weakness. They got sloppy, thinking no one was looking closely enough. Your insight about the asset forfeiture accounts was the key, Hayes acknowledged. The pattern wouldn't have been apparent to someone without your specialized experience. My criminal experience, you mean? Frank said bluntly. Yes. Hayes didn't sugarcoat it. Sometimes it takes a thief to catch a thief, and Keller. Any sign of him? Hayes shook her head. Nothing concrete. Rumors place him in various locations, Dubai, Singapore, even Moscow. But nothing we can act on yet. He'll resurface, Frank said with certainty. Men like Keller can't stay hidden forever. They need to be seen, to exercise power. That's their weakness, and perhaps... Hayes stood to leave. In any case, your contribution has been noted. There's talk of reducing your sentence further, depending on continued cooperation and results. After she left, Frank returned to his work with renewed energy. The prospect of a reduced sentence was appealing, but it wasn't his primary motivation. Something had changed in him during this process, a shift from the man who had once convinced himself that breaking the law was justified if it served what he saw as a greater good. Now he understood the flaw in that thinking. It was the same justification Orion used, that rules could be bent or broken by those who deemed themselves worthy to decide when such exceptions were warranted. That path led only to corruption, no matter how noble the initial intentions. 2 more years passed. The Orion investigation expanded, then contracted as more members were identified and arrested. Frank's role evolved from identifying connections to predicting Orion's adaptations to the increasing pressure. His insights helped the task force stay one step ahead as the organization grew more desperate. Tom Reynolds was released on parole after serving 18 months of his 3-year sentence. He returned to his family, finding work as a security consultant for a private firm, one of the few employment options available to a former officer with a criminal record. He sent Frank a letter of thanks, which Frank read several times before filing away without response. Some bridges couldn't be rebuilt, no matter how much both parties might wish it. Liz Chen completed her house arrest and began her probation period. She moved to Maine as she had always planned, though under very different circumstances than she had envisioned. Occasionally, she still consulted on Orion cases, her expertise remaining valuable even as the organization began to crumble. 3.5 years into Frank's sentence, less than half of his original 8 years, Joseph Keller was finally located in a remote village in southern Spain. The Spanish authorities, working with the FBI, moved to arrest him only to find him dead in his villa. Suicide, according to the official report, though Frank had his doubts when he reviewed the file. With Keller gone and most of the Orion network dismantled, the task force began to wind down. Frank's utility diminished as the cases moved from investigation to prosecution. It was during this period that Hayes visited him one last time. She looked older than when they had first met on that coastal road, the stress of the Orion investigation having taken its toll. "The Justice Department has reviewed your case," she informed him without preamble. "In light of your substantial cooperation, which has led to the dismantling of a major criminal enterprise within federal law enforcement, they've agreed to commute the remainder of your sentence." Frank stared at her, processing this unexpected news. "I'm being released?" "With conditions," Hayes clarified. 5 years of supervised release, regular check-ins with a parole officer, no contact with former associates involved in criminal activity, no employment in law enforcement or security fields. "When?" Frank asked simply. "Processing takes time. 2 weeks, perhaps 3. Hayes studied him curiously. "You don't seem as pleased as I expected." Frank considered this. "Freedom is complicated for someone like me. I have no family waiting, no career to return to. My reputation ensures I'll be unwelcome in most circles." "You could relocate," Hayes suggested. "Start fresh somewhere new." "Perhaps," Frank agreed, though without much conviction. The truth was, his work on the Orion case had given him purpose, direction. Without it, freedom seemed more like a void than an opportunity. Hayes seemed to read his thoughts. There might be another option. A private consulting firm that works with law enforcement on complex cases. They've expressed interest in your particular skills once your sentence is complete. The arrangement would satisfy your release conditions while allowing you to use your experience constructively. Frank raised an eyebrow. Your recommendation? Let's call it repayment of a debt, Hayes replied. Your work on Orion saved careers, possibly lives. That counts for something, even against your previous actions. 3 weeks later, Frank Wilson walked out of the Virginia facility, a free man for the first time in nearly 4 years. He carried a small bag containing his few possessions and paperwork for his supervised release. A car waited to take him to temporary housing arranged as part of his release program. As he approached the vehicle, he was surprised to see Liz Chen leaning against it. Her hair now fully gray, but her posture still straight and confident. "Didn't expect to see you here," Frank said as he reached her. "Thought you might want a friendly face on your first day out," she replied. "Besides, I owed you a visit after what you did for me and Tom." Frank shrugged. "We were partners. That meant something even at the end." They drove in silence for a while, the Virginia countryside passing by the windows. Finally, Liz spoke again. "Hayes told me about the consulting offer. Are you going to take it?" "Probably," Frank admitted. "Not much else for an ex-cop with a federal conviction on his record." "It's good work," Liz nodded. "Using what we know to prevent others from making the same mistakes. Finding a way forward despite the past." Frank glanced at her. "Is that what you've been doing in Maine? Finding a way forward?" "Trying to," she said honestly. "Some days are better than others. The guilt doesn't go away, but you learn to live with it, to use it as a reminder." As they continued toward the city, Frank looked out at the world he was rejoining. So much had changed, both in that world and within himself. His attempt to blackmail the FBI director had destroyed his career. But in a strange twist of fate, it had also led to the dismantling of a corrupt network that might otherwise have continued operating unchecked for years. Was that redemption? Frank wasn't sure. Perhaps redemption was too grand a concept for what had happened. Maybe it was simply consequences, both the punishment for his crimes and the unexpected good that had come from his fall. Whatever it was, Frank Wilson faced his future with a clarity he had lacked 4 years earlier. His old life was gone forever, destroyed by his own choices. But ahead lay the possibility of building something new from the ruins, something that acknowledged his past failures while not being defined by them. As they reached the outskirts of the city, Frank made a decision. He would take the consulting job. He would use what he had learned, both from his crimes and from helping to bring down Orion, to prevent others from following the same path. It wasn't a fresh start. His actions had forever closed that door, but it was a way forward, a way to ensure that the destruction of his career served some greater purpose in the end. "You know," Liz said as they neared their destination, "for what it's worth, I think you're getting a second chance that most people in your position never see." Frank nodded slowly. "Not a second chance at the same life. That's gone. But a chance to build something different, something better maybe." "That's all any of us can hope for," Liz replied quietly. As the car pulled up to the building where Frank would begin his new life, he felt neither triumph nor despair, just a steady resolve to face whatever came next with the hard-won wisdom of someone who had lost everything and found, in that loss, an unexpected path forward.